Hello, my name is Brant. Today is the 22nd day of August, and I wanted to go into some more detail about the particular views of Augustine and Pelagius on the theology of the fall. I think this is important for people to hear. This is from a particular document I've got. I had it for a few years, that is, and it's an explanation of what really is two different views here, okay? Augustine and Pelagius. To Augustine, this story was the literal truth, and his entire philosophy of salvation, grace, and evil stemmed from it. Moreover, Augustine's ideas became the orthodox ideas of the Christian church. Augustine not only codified the orthodox, since then, the doctrines of original sin and divine grace, but to a large extent created it. That's true, he did create it. This was never taught in the early church. Never. Okay? One of the central tenets of Augustine's theology of original sin was that man was created to be immortal. Okay? Had the fall not occurred, says Augustine, Adam would not have been divested of his body, but would have been clothed upon with immortality and incorruption, that immortality might have been swallowed up of life. That is, that he might have passed from the natural body into the spiritual body. Another postulate of his theology was that it was original sin that caused the corruption and evil in God's creation. So there's no concept here of duality here, what he's talking about. This approach was developed because to Augustine, a creature created to depart from the will of God would not be wicked, only a creature intended to abide by God's will, which then subsequently departed from it, would create wickedness. So you see his premise here is that, first of all, that we were immortal in looking at things, and so that's where his premise is already starting. That's his presupposition. And let's see, where was I at? So let's see. Only a creature intended to abide by God's will, which the subsequent departed from it, would create a wickedness. Okay, that's where I was at. Thus, to Augustine, the evil we see around us is a result of creatures acting contrary to their nature by sinning. Okay. So this is a very dark perspective also. The final and perhaps most important aspect of Augustine's theology of original sin is its transmission. According to Augustine, the original sin of Adam was transmitted through sexual intercourse. This is what it's all about. He has a really issue with this, to his descendants. And I think he has a problem with the issue of sex. Okay, so he sees that this is somewhat a evil thing now. It wasn't that way when he was a Manichaean, but this has changed. He's completely changed. Opposite. Likewise, all of his descendants of Adam had original sin, with the exception of Christ, who was not conceived through sexual intercourse. The ultimate consequence of this idea, and one that Augustine did not shirk from, was that unbaptized infants are damned. This damnation occurred because even though infants may have committed no actual sin, their original sin was not cleansed with grace. So this is his idea, grace. This was also created. When God interjects and is in this, there's a completely different perspective of grace with Pelagius than it is with Augustine. Augustine is a hands-on grace, while the grace that was taught by Pelagius was indeed the opposite. It was just, grace was everywhere. It was given. It wasn't it was a given. And so they were doomed to hell. So he had a perspective that basically they were going to hell. By the way, the early church at first did not teach heaven and hell, especially hell. But that changed. And sometime we'll deal with that particular subject also. In Augustine's view, because of the fallen man, the world is made corrupt and imperfect. So here again, his premise again is that way. So he's going to hold on to that premise. His ideas here. God, on the other hand, is unchanging, all good and perfect. Interesting enough, Augustine did not think that the corruption made creation evil. Instead, claims Augustine, God uses the foreknowledge of his creatures' wickedness to create good out of their evil caused by creatures. This view of the world as imperfect compared to an unchanging good God is similar to the ideas of the Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism was a religious and philosophical movement of the 3rd and 4th century that taught that all reality emanated from the One, its unknowing divine source. As a teacher of philosophy and rhetoric in North Africa, Augustine was strongly influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy for his conversion to Christianity. Even after converting to Christianity, he adopted many Neoplatonic ideas to suit his new faith. So that's Augustine's view there. Okay, just a short snippet. Now, let's look at Pelagius' theology of the fall also. Pelagius' theory of the fall was distinctly separate from that of Augustine, and this difference helped to shape his moral philosophy. According to Pelagius, human beings were created mortal. Okay, so there's the presupposition there. Looking at what he sees is simply that man was going to die no matter what. So there's a different perspective. And Adam would have died even if he had not fallen. Even if he had never messed up, he would have passed away. Thus, it was not Adam's sin that caused death. Rather, death in a natural part of the world that God created. Also, Pelagius taught that the original sin was simply Adam's sin. Makes perfect sense. He's the one that made the mistake. That's his problem. You have to deal with it individually. It does not cover the whole of all mankind. And that's where Christianity strayed immensely. Adam screwed up just like we screw up, okay? But what Augustine does here is that he is making it that one person, because they're immortal, is going to affect all of the humans, all humans, from then on to even to now, okay? So instead, Adam set an example of sinning that others follow. That's what it means. See, this is the key of who Jesus is. He sets an example that's contrary to Adam. So you see this example, okay? Not what others tell you. So in Pelagius' theology, infants are born without the need for baptism. Another important difference between the theology of Augustine and Pelagius was that while Augustine blames the fall for the existence of evil in the world, okay, Pelagius believed that the fall was a good thing. He writes a letter to Demetrius, a Christian convert. But if God had simply instructed Adam and Eve to eat from the tree, and they had obeyed, they would have been acting like children. So he forbade them from eating the fruit. This meant that they themselves had to make a decision whether to eat or not to eat, just as a young person needs to defile his parents in order to grow to maturity. So Adam and Eve needed to defy God in order to share his knowledge of good and evil. By defying God, Adam and Eve grew to maturity in his image. So this is a test type of deal. This is what I would call simply is that it's not like one major thing that you've done and you're now being shamed and blamed and treated with guilty, and which is what is taught in churches today. It's all about shame, it's all about blame, and it's all about guilt. Okay? And this is why people are miserable in churches. There's no life in it. Okay? They're hit over the head that you're a very bad person. In fact, the Calvinistic church is even worse. You're despicable and you're a worm. So you're a really, really bad person. In Pelagius' view, Adam and Eve, by eating the fruit, gained maturity and therefore freedom. This freedom meant that Adam and Eve and Eve became responsible to God for their actions. That's what it's all about, responsibility. Okay? We have the ability to respond. The world before the fall was not yet totally good because it lacked one essential attribute, namely freedom. The freedom to decide. Free will. So in Pelagius' view, Adam and Eve through disobedience became good, since according to Pelagius the fall was a good thing. God's creation was not corrupted by man's disobedience, as it was in Augustine's view. Indeed, to Pelagius, the presence of God's Spirit in all living things is what makes them beautiful. So, as we go on here, I want to give this is the next part I want to talk about is the scriptural support for the view of Augustine and also the scriptural support for what Pelagius taught. Augustine's interpretation of the fall is based on a very literal reading of Genesis, while Pelagius chooses a more allegory interpretation. Augustine viewed the account in Genesis as historical truth. This being the case, and follow me here, this is what all churches are. They look at the Bible as being literal truth, and not looking at it as an allegory or a story or a parable. Okay? Augustine viewed the account in Genesis as historical truth. This brings the case part of Augustine's view of original sin can be derived from the curse that God puts upon Adam and Eve once they are thrown out of the Garden of Eden, based upon Genesis 3:16 through 24. Another measure of support for the notion of original sin comes from Paul in the first letter to the Corinthians. In this letter, Paul writes, "For just as in Adam all died, so too in Christ shall all be brought to life." This passage implies that the reason that Christ is necessary is because of Adam's original sin. Okay, these are some verses that those are going to support the Augustine view. So the Pelagius view is completely differently. Upon examining Pelagius' interpretation of original sin, it apparently that this account is consistent with the words of Christ according to the Gospels. For instance, in Matthew 19:14, Jesus states to let the children come to me, and do not prevent them. For the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. Since heaven is presumably for those who have been purified by God and worthy of entrance, then children too must have its quality of innocence. By this statement, Christ can be said to believe in innocence, sinlessness of children. Although Christ could never explicitly say that he meant, explicitly says what he means by this statement, it is certainly a valid interpretation giving Pelagius' premises. Also, the idea that original sin is hereditary is contrary to other parts of the Bible. In other words, it is not passed down to another person in your family. If someone does wrong, it doesn't go against you. So, an example of this is in Deuteronomy 24:16. It is written, "Fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor children for their fathers." In other words, see, they're given that's their lives to live. Only for his own guilt shall man be put to death. This being the case, why would God allow the transmission of original sin and therefore death from Adam to the descendants? Augustine argued that original sin caused the loss of grace for Adam. Okay, let me say it again. He argued that original sin caused the loss of grace for Adam. In other words, he didn't have any grace neither. And thus that grace was not present in his descendants. This argument is very weak. If God is the ultimate good, then any severance of humanity connections with God would be a punishment, since humans would no longer be exposed to the ultimate source of good. Thus, Adam's descendants are punished because of Adam's sin. So what's the problems with Augustine's interpretation of the fall? There are also problems with the idea that only the actions of creatures are responsible for evil. Okay, if God is omnipotent and he has pronounced the world to be good, then how can the act of one person undo that goodness? As David Ray Griffin points out, if, as Augustine claims, nothing happens other than what God wills to happen, then God must be the cause of evil. Yes, true. Yeah, this is the whole idea that simply is if God is omnipotent, he controls everything, then in reality, then he's responsible for sin, and we are robots. And see, when you look at this and what Augustine's done, he destroyed free will. And then he had to come in and basically say that, with that, God is omnipotent, and so he's in control of everything, so that he doesn't allow any freedom. So he has to create this grace later on, what we call prevenient grace. So Augustine attempts to work around this problem by stating that through creatures go against the divine will in one sense, that is violating the commandments, they do not go against the eternal divine will, because God creates good in the long run. Indeed, Augustine argues that the world is better off with evil in it because of the good it creates. However, this argument does not make sense. Either God wills for his creatures to follow his commandments, or he doesn't. How can God, who is perfect, will a contradiction? Yes. How could he? And violating a commandment leads to a greater good than a world in which a creature follows them without free will. Then why is it sin to violate a commandment? Augustine does not answer this question, so his doctrine of humans causing evil is untenable. One problem with Pelagius' interpretation of the fall, at least for Christians, is the fact that Scripture does not support his positive view of the fall. In the Christian tradition, the fall is almost always seen as bad, since it separates humanity from continual communion with God. However, most modern Christian denominations see Genesis as being allegorically rather than literal, and Pelagius' view, while unconventionally it is a valid interpretation given his other theological premises. Another problem with his interpretation is that if infants are innocent and sinless, then any infant could be sacrificed in order to redeem the sins of the world, since both infants and Christ are sinless. If this is the case, then Christ's death has far less meaning, since his perfection is no longer an issue. However, what this argument does not address is that to Christians, Jesus is the incarnation of God, and thus is superior to human beings, no matter how sinless. Now, I beg the difference with that. I see that Jesus is just an example, and I also don't see it as a literal interpretation here. I see simply as this is a story, allegory of Jesus. So you have a different perspective. Moreover, Christ was not only sinless, but also perfectly virtuous because he committed good works and defied temptation. So he didn't even fall for temptations, you see, which infants do not have that chance to do. Of course they don't. They don't even have the knowledge. They don't even have any idea what's going on. That's why, in a lot of ways, they're innocent. They don't have any idea what's going on. They don't understand the term of what is good and right, and wrong and right, whatever you want to call. They don't have that knowledge to be able to make a decision. And I find that many Christians said this, and this really bothered me. They would say simply their kids were bad because they disobeyed their parents. Really? Wow. Wow, that's almost, that's really scary when parents say that. You know why it's scary? They see their children as evil. They don't see the goodness of them at all. They see the opposite. You see? So the idea that infants deserve eternal life does not negate Christ's sacrifice. So we go on the age of simply as, I'm going to try to do this if I've got time. We'll look at what I call grace, salvation, and redemption. This is a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. People seem not to see that their opinion of the world is also a confession of character. As a consequence of their differing views of original sin, Augustine and Pelagius also had widely different views on the nature of salvation. This difference became the essence of the heresy that would bear Pelagius' name, although some scholars such as David Christie Murray and Joan O'Grady dismissed the Pelagius heresy as a battle between men with two different types of experiences and attitudes rather than a serious theological battle. The implications of the Pelagius heresy was much further reaching. In fact, had the church accepted this heresy, it probably would have necessary a complete new way of thinking about the nature of God. Now, the Augustine's view of salvation. To Augustine, any notion of salvation was rooted first and foremost in the idea of absolute sovereignty of God. So you can see this is what he taught, and those in the Reformation do this the same way. That is Martin Luther and John Calvin. They believe in this. They promoted it. They pushed this. So Augustine meant that God is not being bound by external law. In other words, we cannot compel God to save us from damnation. We are saved solely by his will. This sovereignty underlies Augustine's whole theory of salvation. Another aspect of Augustine's salvation theology is derived from his ideas of original sin, because original sin claims, Augustine, humans are so hopelessly corrupted that we are absolutely incapable of doing anything good by our own forces. You see that? Free choice is meant a choice between good and evil had been utterly wasted by sin. Our will, insofar as it desires, not God, can merely do evil and desire evil. Free will, in this case, becomes non-existent because humans become incapable of committing any acts but evil ones. Wow. Why try? Why try? Why try? Okay. Augustine argues that since humans are incapable of doing good by their own choice, all virtue must be accompanied solely through the grace of God. Here it is. Okay. So God has to enter the picture. Okay. The most monstrous of people may perform acts of heroism, but only because of God's intervention. Likewise, the sanctiest person becomes depraved when the grace of God temporarily leads them, such as Peter's denial of Christ. Thus, it is through the working of grace that people are saved. There is no other mechanism, because anyone else would disrupt the absolute sovereignty of God. If God had to save someone because of a rule, then he would neither be sovereign nor omnipotent. Now, what it's talking about here simply is that God is you. So this is where all this stuff is really a problem, because people see God as an outside force and having enormous affairs upon. Also, the problem with the word God is simply who is God? He doesn't even have a name, you see. I think this is really what bothers me sometimes. So, how then can a person receive the grace of God in order to be saved? According to Augustine, there is only one answer. God bestows it. It's upon a person arbitrarily and acting with divine mercy. It is unrelated to the faith of a person, because God bestows faith. So God does everything for you. This is why John MacArthur and John Piper and others, these are two major ones I remember, and I assume probably Chuck Swindoll is another one, of the preachers that are in the evangelical churches and are major players. God does everything for you. He cleans you up. Another person would have been the pastor Lucer at Moody Bible, Moody Church, Moody Bible, somewhere, I can't remember. He's at Moody Bible Institute, the church there. Because humans are only capable of doing evil, the only just course for God to take would be to damn all of his creatures. However, because God has mercy, he chooses to save a certain number of people, called the elect. Get it? They're the elect. So, as one friend used to say to me, you're the part of the frozen chosen. Most important to Augustine's argument is that the elect have done nothing at all to deserve their salvation, he writes. Certainly such an election is of grace and not of all merits, of course. Keeping with this argument, Augustine also argues that Christ did not die for all of mankind. Rather, he died solely for the salvation of his elect. This idea was held by Augustine because it was unthinkable that he, Jesus, should deliberately have shed his own blood in vain or sacrifice himself for hell dwellers to be. Although to Augustine, the salvation of the elect was foreknown by God because of the creation of the universe. So in other words, this is all planned out by God. The church also plays a vital role in salvation, first and foremost in the need for baptism, especially of infants. Since all children are born with original sin, it is necessary for them to be baptized so that they can receive the grace of God. Moreover, the sacraments are also necessary for the elect. Since the church ordained the sacraments and Christ himself founded the church, particularly Augustine claims that the sacrament of the Eucharist is essential for salvation. As he wrote in against the two letters of the Pelagius, for unless they shall eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, they shall not have life to themselves. So to Augustine, the church is necessary for the salvation of the elect. Now, the last part of it here is something that someone pointed out to me many years ago. And it really bothers me, this particular practice of the sacrament that's taken with the eating of the bread and the drinking of the wine, which are representing something else. To me, it sounds like carnalism. You see. For unless they shall eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, they shall not have life in themselves. Sounds satanic to me. very much so. So I'm going to end it here since it's almost 25 minutes and my voice is about to go for now. And we'll talk about Pelagius salvation theology in the next segment. Thank you.